Chapter 25. They heard the explosions and even saw the glare of bright lights over the top of the ship. Rags had given the thing quite a bit to think about. Then, Keko canted hard to starboard and upward nearly simultaneously. The boat seemed to hang in the air for the space of a long breath before the bow crashed into the ocean. Sarah glanced at Alan. "What the fuck?" "Nest!" Alan shouted into the transmitter. "Sit rep! Sound off!" When Rags spoke a moment later, Alan seemed to deflate into himself.
"Salty! Fucking thing dove after it hit us. Sinclair's checking damage, but I think we're taking on water. Over."
Alan hissed through his teeth. "Nest, give me an update as soon as you have the report. Over."
"Copy, Salty. Out."
Alan shrugged at Sarah. "What the fuck do we do now? Another hit like that and they might sink."
"Along with all our gear and provisions."
Alan nodded. "Not to mention our only real redoubt. Can't let her sink." Sarah saw the anger on his face, knowing he was thinking of Kojo and Rags, and the fact that he'd already lost Hippie. The crew had to evacuate the ship. How could they possibly survive with that thing swimming beneath them? Shit, how could any of them?
"We move," Sarah said. "Cut the distance between us and Keko. How fast can we pull up the light array in the ROV?"
He gritted his teeth and headed for the controller. "I'll get the winch moving. It's not strong enough to lift the whole array, so get ready to help." Sarah knew why he was grinding his teeth. This was wasting precious time. They might only have a moment or two before M2 returned to crack the ship in half. Every second they spent pulling up the cables was another second they weren't on their way to assist Keko. Sweat dripped from his forehead and ran down his nose as he concentrated on the controller. Sarah checked the equipment laid out before her. They each had an AR, an underwater bolt rifle, a few phosphorus grenades, and one AP grenade. The latter was non-incendiary, but was made to pierce armor with its shockwave.
"Might not make a big dent in the creature, but it might be enough to ward it off or crack its shell and expose the liquid beneath. Just enough for a phosphorus bolt or round to strike home. Blow the fucker up."
"Go to the cables," Alan said calmly but firmly. Sarah scrambled to the diving deck and began reeling in the cable. She made out the ring of lights in the ROV's headlamp. The light arrays rose, their cables tangling and the bulbs dying a moment later. The winch ground for a moment as though it didn't like all that weight at once, but smoothed out while she guided the cable into the spool. The ROV rose higher in the water, but well away from the tangled mess that had become the light stands. As the pile neared the top, she plunged her hands into the water and helped the winch raise the equipment above the surface. Alan was at her elbow in half a second, crouching with his long arms and hands clutching the metal frames. He lifted with his knees, grunting, and heaved the mass into the Zode. He immediately reached back into the water and grabbed the ROV cable. "Get us moving." Sarah didn't ask questions, but moved to the dais and quickly tapped the throttle. The Zode accelerated to 30 knots, the distance between the two craft rapidly decreasing until the Zode was only a dozen or so meters away. "Stop us here," Alan called to her. A snarl of looping snakes of cables twisted around the metal frames covered the Zode's aft deck. Alan had returned to the dais and looked over her shoulder. Sarah reversed the throttle, and the Zode's motor spun the propellers in the opposite direction, driving a few frothy swells to the surface. "Nest," Alan said. "We're close enough to hold hands, but not to fuck. Over."
"Salty, we've got a puncture below the waterline. Sinclair's got it patched for now, but another hit and we're done. Over."
"Copy. Hold."
"Copy."
He locked eyes with Sarah. "We have to take it out now," Alan said, scrambling for his air tank. "Take me to the stern." She rolled her eyes.
"And you're going to do what exactly?"
He grinned at her, but his eyes held a homicidal glint. "Whatever I can do to distract it." He pulled on his mask, slung the bolt rifle over his shoulder, and clipped on his fins. Sarah didn't bother replying. She grabbed the transmitter and goosed the Zode toward Keko's aft.
"Nest, Salty's moving aft. Diver in the water."
"He's what?"
The Zode reached Keko's starboard stern, and Alan stepped to the diving platform. "You might team the fuck out of here," he said to Sarah, and dropped over the side. Sarah watched him splash into the water, a question on her lips. She looked around the deck as if something in the Zode might answer her. The tangle of cables caught her eye. Alan descended into immediate darkness. The Zode's running lights, set to low and in the wrong damn spectrum anyway, added little to dispel the shadows immediately surrounding him. Alan tapped the mask and the headlamp came to life. He also pulled the UV flashlight from his belt and turned it on while he swam close to the keel. "You're a fucking idiot," he said to himself as he swung out a free hand and grabbed the keel's edge. The ship's props were mere meters away. If Sinclair started them for whatever reason, he'd be chopped to pieces. Alan took a quick look in the upper hemisphere, knowing at a glance there was nothing there. If there were, its shadow would be backlit by the floodlights. That done, he peered downward, his headlight casting a tight, focused beam of bright white. The light seemed to evaporate long before it should have, and it also seemed to sparkle. Instead of the massive thing they'd seen earlier, the creature appeared to have lost at least a third of its mass. Still, it could eat the damn ship if it wanted to. The darkness facing him rolled over and became a blanket of ash. Alan's heart seemed to freeze as his eyes took in the horror below him. Several fin-like appendages, each glittering as if dusted with diamonds, sprouted upward from the dorsal side, triangular patterns of encrusted diamonds peering at him like gilded insect eyes. Its snout, if you could call it that, wore nearly the same hood he'd seen earlier, only now that he was within meters of the thing, he'd clearly underestimated just how fucking big it was.
"Alan!"
Rags called.
"Where the fuck are you?"
"On the keel like a limpet, so don't start the props. It's below me," he said, doing his best to sound calm, although he was anything but. He half expected the creature to come after him, dart upward at incredible speed, and snap him up like a midnight snack. Instead, the thing remained nearly a dozen meters below, swimming in a tight circle. It did not, however, roll over again. If Alan had known that he'd been looking at the creature's unprotected belly, he would have dropped the phosphorus grenade and taken his chances. He couldn't believe he'd missed the opportunity. "Nest, its dorsal may be armored, but its ventral side isn't as much. Over." Alan readjusted his position on the keel, ensuring he wasn't about to drop free into the water. He didn't know if the creature hadn't noticed him, or if it didn't consider him a threat. Yet. That'll change soon, he thought.
"Alan!"
Rags sounded angry, frustrated, and terrified all at the same time.
"What do you want to do?"
"I want to get back in the Zode, roar to the shore, and sleep beneath a canopy of trees far away from the fucking water." "Ain't figured that out yet," Alan said. "If it starts heading for the ship, I'll fire the bolt rifle. After that, I guess I'll start using grenades. Over."
"How's that going to work?"
Rags asked.
"Any concussion damage is going to hurt you, too, and you won't be able to get away from phosphorus residue."
"Yeah, didn't think about that before you leaped into the water like a fucking idiot, did you?" No, he hadn't. The thing below him continued its circle, although it had risen at least a meter since it began its last turn. Corkscrewing upward, Alan thought. That can't be good. What was the best way to attract it? The creature broke off its circle and headed further toward the ocean. The speed at which it moved was more than a little disconcerting. It accelerated in the water like a sports car on a racetrack. He wasn't sure the Zode could outpace it even with the throttle wide open. The thing disappeared altogether, leaving Alan staring into the nest of shadows lingering just beyond the floodlights' white halos. "Nest," Alan said. "It's headed back out to the ocean."
"Alan,"
Sarah said over the comms.
"it's going to come back."
"I know." "Rags, I've got 7 bolts. I've got 3 phosphorus grenades and one of the explosive variety. After that, I've got a diving knife, my cock, and not much else." No humor in Rags's voice.
"Copy. What's your plan?"
Second time you've asked that, Alan thought. "Yes, because you haven't answered the question. Distraction. How do I distract it?" Flare. He had 3 diving flares, all magnesium rather than phosphorus. That was bound to be better than wagging his wang at the thing. He pulled one of the flares from his belt, struck its top, and the cylinder came to life with a garish red light. Alan let go of the hull and swam further into the ocean. With the flare in one hand and his other clutching his rifle, he kicked his legs hard and fast for a few seconds to ensure he had enough room. 10 meters, maybe. Far enough, he supposed. He swam downward another meter or 2 just to be safe, and brandished the diving flare at the darkness. The shadows stuttered and flickered in the flare's uneven light. His breath caught in his throat each time he made out a shadow that could be M2.
"Alan?"
Rags said.
"I've almost lost sight of you."
"Copy, Nest. Going to try and distract it." He descended another meter with gentle kicks, eyes scanning the darkness for any movement or change in hue. There might be a bioluminescent fish or 2 swimming around here, but no way could he mistake one of them for M2. No bloody way. He figured he had another 4 or 5 minutes before the diving flare went out, which meant he could do this for 25 minutes or so with his cache of flares, assuming he chain-lit them. Only problem? How would he know when it was time to burn the next one? How would he know to wait a little longer? The sun. Dawn was coming. Sarah had said the entity would search for a shelter from the killing sunlight, meaning it didn't have much time before it would have to take an alternative option. If, that was, it was smart enough to have one and didn't just decide to go for broke. You're thinking of it more and more like a person, or at least a smart animal. I am at that, Alan said to himself. Wish I'd thought that earlier. 10 meters from his current location, something twinkled near where the ocean floor might have been if the land hadn't cracked in two. Instead, whatever it was hovered 6 or 7 meters above the change in topography, but was still mostly parallel to Alan. The twinkle disappeared, and he took a deep breath. His heart beat fast, adrenaline thrummed in his veins, and his blood felt electric. M2 might have melted into the darkness again, but he knew that had been the creature. Moreover, it had seen him this time. He was sure of it. That meant it was coming. If it had found him via the light, he hoped the addition of a fresh flare might give it a little incentive to hurry the fuck up. He grabbed one of the remaining flares and popped the cap, its light adding to the red fuzz surrounding him. A few seconds later, the red light twinkled off the edge of something. A second later, the front of M2 glowed and sparkled. The creature was smaller than it had been before, more densely packed. Several eyes swiveled to stare at him from the clusters adhering to its jaws, lower and upper lips, tentacles jutting from its mouth like catfish whiskers. The creature's dorsal was that strange ashen color, the top of its head an anvil-shaped battering ram. 6 fins, each sporting an eye cluster and tentacle, rose upward, while 2 pectoral fins on either side moved in concert like the oars of a slave galley. Alan dropped the first flare. The fallen flare's glow continued for a moment as it descended into the depths. Instead of waning away, it disappeared as though snatched by an invisible mouth. A second later, the pinpoint of light returned. M2 had followed it down. His eyes narrowed. He had one more flare left. If he needed to, he could toss it and slip past the creature, assuming it chased the lure. The water's current pushed against him as the force of the creature's dive finally reached him. He almost sighed in relief, because that meant the creature had gone past him and not lingered. It also meant he now had no idea where it was. Chapter 26. Sarah finished untangling enough of the cables to find the important bits. Apart from a single floodlight, she tossed the rest of the light array aside. Sweat dripped from her scalp as she connected wires, guessing at more than a few of the connections, and finally ran juice through the system. The ROV display claimed the vehicle had passed diagnostics and was ready for the water. She clicked one more button, the one to power the light array, and the single UV floodlight she'd strapped to the ROV's nose came to life, bathing the gunnel in bright purple. Sarah ran one more check before lugging the ROV to the edge and gently placing it in the water. The drone remained floating there, its side bumping the Zode's hull with dull thuds. After setting the cable winch to low drag, she scrambled to the dais and started the ROV. The drone hissed as it sucked in water for the ballast, and a set of statuses appeared on the display. Sarah took a deep breath. Okay, let's see how I can fuck this up. Her fingers moved the sticks, the ROV responding sluggishly to the commands. The drone's rear cam display showed her the rapidly diminishing glare of the Zode's lights as it descended. Sarah spent far longer than she wanted to, making sure she wasn't tangled up and had the drone pointed in the right direction. Still unsure, but uncertain she ever would be, she pressed forward on the throttle and the drone took off, the cable unspooling with a steady hiss. M2 saw the red beacon. It was much closer than the large metal object had been, although M2 could still make out the distant craft's lights. This red, however, was different. Not dangerous at all, but interesting. M2 swam toward it, and suddenly there were 2 lights. Confused, it slowed for a moment. One of the lights diminished to a glow while the other fell through the water. Sensing food, M2 dove for the falling light. The cylinder casting the red light made it nearly to the ocean floor before M2 reached it. Rather than consuming it, it moved within half a meter and matched its descent. The flare hit the ocean floor with a tiny puff of sand, the magnesium burning a sinister red. M2 watched it momentarily before extruding an armored tentacle that ended in a sludgy colloidal point. Once sure the burning object couldn't or wouldn't attack, M2 cautiously moved the limbs into the cylinder and touched the surface. The material instantly melted. M2 pulled back before readjusting its position and touching the middle of the flare's casing. Again, it quickly digested the material. However, it felt enormous heat. The burning thing at the cylinder's end was dangerous. M2 pulled back the tentacle and slowly rose above the cursed object. The light had held the promise of food, but hadn't been food. M2 was certain that whatever had dropped the flare was a meal in waiting. A substantive one at that. The creature turned lazily a few meters above the ocean floor and looked upward. It could still see the bare signs of the lights up there, the ones that didn't or couldn't hurt it. M2 had already figured out how to discern the lights that would damage it versus those that didn't. Now it knew the difference between the cylinders that exploded and those that only burned. While the latter was still dangerous, they were easily avoided. M2 rose another few meters and found a new light moving just below the ocean's surface. It also picked up the vibrations of sound waves. Whatever was moving made that vibration, and although M2 didn't know what a motor was, it had already associated the sound with artificial movement. Not food, but something food used. The moving light halted a short distance from where the flare had been dropped. M2 waited and watched, unsure what to do. Sunrise was coming. M2 would have to decide whether another attack was worth the risk or if it should abandon its prey and seek shelter. One of the lights above it jiggled with lifelike motion. The food was still in the water. M2 spread itself thinner, moving mass from its ventral side to bolster the dorsal side. More armor. A more vulnerable belly, too. The creature was no longer shaped like a shark, but more like a stingray with fins and a humped middle. M2 prepared to attack. The magnesium flare in Alan's hand sputtered, and he didn't think it would be long before it died. He'd hang on to it until it finally burned out, but the idea of once again being in the dark, with no warning that the creature was coming at him, terrified him. Why the fuck did he take this job?
Alan?
Sarah said over the headset.
The robot's headed your way.
What? Alan asked, and turned in the water. The ROV's headlamp stabbed through the darkness like a laser, and his ears finally caught the electric motor's gentle whine. The robot pointed downward and slowed, the light no longer blinding Alan. It drifted toward him, but was still a good 2 meters away. When his vision returned to normal, he made out a misshapen tangle of cables wrapped around the drone, and the massive floodlight embedded within. What have you done, Dr. Frankenstein?
I hate not being able to do anything. Figure at least I can provide you some company.
Alan grinned. Maybe move it a few meters down. Give me a heads up.
Copy.
Tell me, does it work? Sarah sounded offended.
Of course it works.
He chuckled. Let's grab that mojito in an hour or two.
Copy that.
The robot smoothly descended, the cable following it like a snake. When the ROV had dropped 3 meters below him, it slowly rotated.
Okay, I'll keep scanning for movement.
Sound is a pound, Alan said. Rags, you still with us?
Here. Harper and I are looking for sign. Over.
Alan relaxed a little. It wasn't exactly the perfect surveillance setup, but he might at least have a second or two warning he wouldn't otherwise have. Although in the water, that wasn't much time to react at all. Better than nothing, you ungrateful bastard. How long before dawn? 30 minutes? 45? He had enough air to last that long. What he didn't have was a solid perimeter, or cover. The flare sputtered again and sparked in jerks and fits, the magnesium ribbon inside almost exhausted. Alan flexed his fingers to keep them from cramping and fumbled the flare. He stabbed out to grab the cylinder, but hit its edge and knocked it further away. The flare fell and slowly accelerated as it dropped into the darkness. Alan cursed in disgust, his hand reaching for the last one, already hating himself for needing it, as though it were a nightlight. Before the flare completely extinguished, something in the darkness twinkled with that telltale glossy sheen. Just as it began to take shape, the flare went out. Alan gritted his teeth. Playtime was over. It's beneath me, he said. Probably 15 to 20 meters. He turned off his lights and slowly ascended, just another meter or two further away from the slowly rotating drone beneath him. Sarah, did you see anything?
No. Sorry. Didn't have enough of a vertical view for that.
Figured. His skin crawled, although he didn't know why. He'd learned long ago to trust that sense that something was out of place, that something terrible was about to happen. He kicked hard and quickly made another 8 meters from where he'd been just a few moments ago. The darkness below changed, a shape melting from the shadows into visibility. The ashen color twinkled in the ROV's lights. He watched in horror as details from its face emerged. A proboscis licked the water, while eye clusters embedded in the jaw peered upward with hungry abandon. The thing continued rising, its vast body slicing through the water as though it were impossibly thin. Or maybe only half there, he thought. Vulnerable belly, maybe. It accelerated, and as it did, Alan realized that if he'd stayed where he'd been, he'd have been snapped up by one of the many proboscises, or impaled on one of the 3 tentacles flailing through the water like the arms of a drowning child.
Alan!
I'm okay, he said, wondering if he'd jinxed himself as M2 continued rising, its edge facing him a mere meter below and less than 2 meters to his right. A series of bubbles rose past Alan, the disturbed water finally brushing against him. He thought M2 was much smaller than it had been, or maybe more malformed was a better word. Regardless, the creature was less substantial, but sleeker and more angular. It flapped its wings, and a moment later, water pushed him further away from both the ship and the creature. He unslung his rifle. He was done with flares.
Alan, ROV took some damage. M2 clipped it on its way by.
Not surprised. I've got a shot. And he did. M2 remained hanging as if frozen, the only motion coming from its tentacles, still searching for something, and the eye stalks sprouting from its thin flank to help in the hunt. The only problem was finding its belly. The ventral side should have been easy to spot, with the creature's dorsal side glowing a dim sparkling gray in the glare of the ship's underwater floods. Just look for the darkness. The problem was that the ventral side cast a long, seemingly impossibly wide shadow, which made discerning between a trick of the light and the creature's ventral side little more than a guess. Salty, get that ROV beneath it, he said, trying to keep his voice level. A tentacle sprouted from the dorsal side, and the creature rose another meter. In a moment or two, it would reach the same depth as the keel. Another meter after that, and it would be high enough to ram full on. If, that was, it returned to the sea to gain momentum.
Alan, going low and I'll bring it up.
The creature had extended multiple tentacles, each rising upward. Any second now, those tentacles would reach the gunwale and search for Rags and Harper. Don't have time to wait, Alan said, firing the rifle. The moment he pulled the trigger, the creature moved toward the aft, and the bolt flew through the water and into the shadows. God damn it, Alan yelled. New tentacles extruded from its fore, and Alan had a pretty good idea what the creature would go after next. He kicked hard until he reached the surface, grabbed the armor-piercing grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, said a silent prayer, and flung it as far as he could. Rags aimed over the gunwale and fired 3 times. Despite the ship's sway, all 3 rounds struck a meter beneath the tentacle's gently waving tip. Sparks flew in all directions as though a transformer had exploded. A cloud of diamond dust dazzled the air around her, grit grinding into her cheeks. Blinking through the dust, she finally saw the tentacle, its tip reforming. Another had joined it, and both were rising toward her. Rags stumbled backward as the ship rocked beneath her, her rival waving in one hand while she tried to keep her balance. "Drop!" Harper yelled. Rags's brain had partially vapor-locked, but the command punched through the unreality and brought back her training. She fell backward, reclaiming the grip on her rifle and rolling her body sideways at the same time. She hit the deck, her left hip and shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. Her ringing ears caught the sound of half a mag's worth of shots rattling off from above and behind her. She rolled again until she faced the gunwale, rifle pointed at where the things had been. 3 tentacles, each sporting an unblinking, emotionless eye that seemed to bore into her soul, peered at her over the gunwale. Harper hadn't hit a single one of the things. Rags aimed, and as she pulled the trigger, the ocean lit up with a bright flash, followed by a low crump she felt in her bones. The tentacles disappeared as though yanked from existence. The ship leaped in the air as a massive bubble rose from the ocean. Keko listed to one side, its hull creaking and groaning. Her teeth rattled when the hull hit the surface, and Keko seemed to bounce as the water rose high against the hull before receding. "Jesus!" Harper shouted.
Alan?
Sarah's voice called over the comms.
"Alan, Salty, sound off!"
Rags yelled. She managed to rise into a crouch and slowly backed away from the gunwale.
"Reload, Mother,"
she said softly. She wasn't moving her eyes from the gunwale. Harper didn't respond, but it was difficult to miss the sound of a magazine clattering to the deck and a fresh one being slammed home in frustration, or maybe disgust. "What the fuck was that?" Harper asked.
"Hush," Rags said, her voice still soft and even. "Alan?"
Nest, I lost sight of Alan. Over.
Sarah didn't sound panicked, but she was close to it.
"What the hell just happened?" Rags asked.
I think Alan fired at it. He might have hit pay dirt. I had eyes on him until the ocean exploded. The ROV isn't responding. Might be tangled up.
"Close enough to hold hands and not close enough to fuck, right?" Rags said.
What?
Sarah sounded confused. Before Rags could respond, Sarah said,
Not anymore. You moved and so did I. But I can get back to you with a throttle push.
Rags nodded slowly.
"You need to get up here. You're too vulnerable there, Salty."
If not for the rumble of the ship's engines, the crash of the surf, and the waves lapping at the hull, Rags would be able to hear Sarah as though she were whispering.
Negative, Nest. Not until I know for sure.
Rags's eyes narrowed.
"What does that mean?"
Then she heard the mosquito whine of the Zode's motors.
"Sarah, damn it!"
Could use a spotter,
she said through the comms. Cursing, Rags looked at Harper.
"Watch my six."
"I'll be watching mine," she croaked. Rags grinned despite herself. She felt cold and her skin vibrated like a live wire. Adrenaline overload, maybe? Or maybe she was struggling with the idea that Alan might have been blown to bits, or even eaten. She ground her teeth.
"Cover in, Salty,"
she said, and headed cautiously to the gunwale. The metal creaked when she leaned against it.
"Hold together, Keko,"
she whispered to the breeze.